have to say, every single time I've heard Margaret talk or managed to spend some time with her, I've always been completely inspired by her insights into the bigger picture of the strange times we're living in. And I remember actually meeting Margaret at a conference 4 years ago, just after the Brexit vote. And I remember she was literally the only person that made me sort of understand and be able to process what was going on and what we needed to think about, and was both incredibly hopeful, but also just damn honest about what needed to happen. And so that's why we're so excited to have her with us this morning. So Margaret's session today, so I'll tell you about Margaret first. Margaret's a multi-company CEO, a professor, a writer for the Financial Times and Huffington Post. She's multiple TED speaker, loads of great short 10, 15-minute talks online where she talks about a number of really, really important topics. She's the author of Willful Blindness, A Bigger Prize, and most recently a book, Uncharted. You can find Margaret on Twitter, Margaret_Heffernan. And this morning, we're going to be talking about how to navigate the future together. Margaret talks about the fact that we crave certainty, but much of the time it is just not available. Why not? And how do we function and drive change without it? I know for me, this is a really, really important subject right now, about how we function in times where there is so much uncertainty, and you know, we crave it and we want it, but actually it doesn't look like there's going to be certainty for a long time to come. So really looking forward to Margaret's wisdom. Enjoy.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Immy. Thank you for an amazing festival. Really the most imaginative, inspiring, creative program I have seen on this topic, or frankly any topic, for a very long time. So welcome to everybody who's here bright and early, first thing in the morning. I hope we can have a really good conversation. I'm going to talk for about half an hour and go through some of the ideas that Immy talked about. And I'm going to leave lots of time for questions, because I think that's when we can really start to drill into the stuff that you care about most. So I want to start with a story, because stories are really the best way that we have for organizing information. And the story is about a woman named Rebecca. Rebecca is a photographer, and she was the first woman to win a bursary to work at the Natural History Unit at the BBC in Bristol. And she had what many people would regard as the sort of dream job, dream career, going around the world making the natural history films for which the BBC is so famous. But over the years, she became increasingly disillusioned. She found that a lot of film crews were specifically ignoring some of the ecological devastation that they saw around them, that some of that was just regarded as a sort of scheduling problem, not a huge existential problem. And she felt more and more committed to trying to do something to draw people's attention to how we were spoiling the earth. And eventually she sold to her commissioning editor a program about people doing fantastic projects in Hawaii. And what she didn't tell him was that her idea for the film was really to focus on what were those people doing. They were cleaning up the oceans, that every single shot in the film would be full of trash and plastic. It sort of looked like a film of beautiful people in Hawaii. It was actually a film about garbage. And when the film went out, she was kind of poised, hoping finally, people would understand what they were doing, the consequences of their action. And the film went out and nothing happened. Nothing. The next program came on. The next day's television came on. The next week's television came on. Here she was, she'd done this amazing, gut-wrenching film, and people had watched it, put the kettle on, and moved on to the next show. So she went back to the market town where she lives in Devon, a place called Modbury, very disillusioned. Here she thought she had found a way to change the world, and she appeared to have changed nothing. And felt like many of us do, which is we think we've got a plan, and then we execute the plan with real focus and dedication, and we think afterwards everything will be different, and so often it isn't. So she sat at home thinking and eventually decided, well, if she couldn't change the world, she would just try to do something small and local to at least feel that she could accomplish something. And she went to all the shopkeepers and traders in Modbury and asked them, could they give up using plastic carrier bags? And some people were really enthusiastic. The butchers were a bit unclear because they needed something to deal with meat juices, but she helped them figure that out. She got all the small traders to agree, and then she brought together all of the bigger traders to say, are you going to support us? And eventually, across the whole town, she got all of the shopkeepers and traders to agree that they would forego plastic bags. And the night before her launch, everyone would get a cloth bag put through their letterbox saying, from tomorrow, Modbury no longer uses plastic bags. It was a small thing, she thought, but at least it was something. She was wrong again, because the next day, yes, everyone started using cloth bags, but the world's media turned up on her doorstep. The BBC, CNN, Russia Today, all kinds of news outlets from all over the world. Look at what this little town can do. And she was talking to one of the journalists who had brought her, and this was several weeks on, who brought her another cloth bag, which says, our province supports Modbury. And she was kind of amused by this. And she said, wow, how many people are in your province? And he said, well, we're in China. This is 32 million people. Rebecca Hosking was the person in a tiny town in Devon who changed the world's attitude to single-use plastic carrier bags. Now, not many people know her name. And what's striking to me is that this is an experiment. This is a story about experiments. She did one experiment which looked like it was a surefire winner, and it failed. And then she did a second experiment which looked like it wouldn't achieve very much, but it might achieve a little something. And she was wrong again. She achieved an enormous amount and a real sea change in the way that people started to think about plastic, so that years later, when another film about plastics in the oceans came out, it kind of met the sentiment that Rebecca had already inspired, and real change started. So why do I start by talking about Rebecca? Well, Rebecca, I think, was in a situation that we're all in, which is we want to do something. We're appalled by many of the things that we see around us, and we don't know how to start. And mostly we think, okay, well, what I need is a plan. And we've all been brought up with what I think of as a kind of planning mindset. And the difficulty with a plan is that it presupposes an end result. And we work back from the end result and try to work together on our plan to do something where we can absolutely predict success, the right kind of outcome. And the truth of the matter is that in the last 20, 30 years, the world has really fought against that mindset, which is to say, the world has become increasingly unpredictable. Experts in forecasting say that if you're really outstandingly good and you hone your skills at forecasting, maybe you'll be right most of the time, but only about 400 days out. For the rest of us who do not apply ourselves to this so much, maybe we can see 150 days out. The very best forecasting system we have in the world is weather, which is at its best 5 days out. Seeing long-term into the future is immensely difficult. And it's particularly difficult because it's often characterized by things which are hugely complex. So you can take something like climate change, which we know is real, but it's specifically ambiguous. Nobody knows which farms are going to flood, which factories are going to flood, or which forests are going to catch fire. If you look at the financial system, the Bank of England says, I think with some courage, that it knows there will be further banking crashes, but it also knows specifically it doesn't know when those will happen or what will make them begin. So this is also perfectly demonstrated by an epidemic. We know that epidemics are always with us. We have always known this, but we don't know when the next one will be. We don't know where it will start, and we don't know what the pathogen will be. There is no profile of an epidemic, so you can't plan for them. So the whole kind of mental model that we've had about the world, which is we plan for outcomes we can predict, has kind of fallen apart. And it's interesting because I think many people, I suspect many of the participants today, understand this on a visceral level. But I think overwhelmingly, this planning mindset is with us. And we keep thinking if we're somehow more rigorous, or we pay more attention to detail, or we apply rules of austerity, then we can kind of force fit a future that we want to see. And yet somehow stuff just keeps happening that doesn't let us do that. And my own view is that there are lots of reasons for this. One is because complexity is inherently unpredictable. There are patterns. We just don't know when they're going to repeat themselves. One reason is because although we think that history repeats itself, so we can take a guide from history, history really doesn't repeat itself. And the reason for this is kind of logically obvious once you start thinking about it. History doesn't repeat itself because people now know things that people in the past did not. The future is made by new knowledge. And so people can look back on things in history and think, oh, it feels a lot like that. But in calling for analogies, what tends to happen is that we overweight similarities and pay too little attention to what's changed in the meantime. So by focusing on something that feels really familiar, that we can plan for, we have a level of confidence we shouldn't have. The classic example of this is the French building the Maginot Line, one of the biggest constructions in the world, second only to the Great Wall of China, gigantic fortification to prevent the German invasion of France. But there are two problems. One is that actually this time, unlike the First World War, in the Second World War, the Germans can see it being built. And secondly, they can therefore make different plans. So the German invasion of France took all of 5 days. The Maginot Line wasn't really in play at all. Equally, you can look at the tragic history of the Vietnam War, which was repeatedly described as being just like fighting Hitler, except, of course, it was nothing to do with Hitler. It was a different country, different history, different culture, different politics. So our believing that history repeats itself actually stops us from understanding truly where we are and what the opportunities are. We make the same mistake often about people, individuals. We have stories that we think are kind of classic stories and profiles of people. We're very fond of typing people. And we somehow believe that if somebody fits a story, that we know the outcome. That if somebody comes from a terrible home and has experiences of violence, that somehow they're doomed. Although, of course, those are the stories we see on television, film. They're the stories we read in books. But we forget that there are many stories that start like that with radically different endings. And of course, the happy ending is almost the least sexy and least covered of all. So we make conclusions about people and where they are in lives. And we do this about ourselves too. And we foreclose opportunities and choices. We also, the classic example of this is we have this kind of belief that DNA determines who we'll be. And we have very high-placed professors telling us, that DNA is your blueprint for your life. Even though under pressure, these people admit, well, it influences 50% of your life. So it's the single biggest influence. But then there's all this other stuff which can change the story completely. And they kind of ignore that, trivialize it, and marginalize it because it's much more difficult to study, so much more fun to look at a single cause, except that those difficult, tricky, accidental things that happen to people in life can change everything. Identical twins born with identical DNA develop different immune systems. That's how powerful the impact of incident can be. So what this shows, when you look at all the models for thinking about the future that try to imply that it's predictable, is that they all fall down. And as much as we might crave the certainty and sometimes the narrative simplicity that these models offer us, actually they're an illusion and I think a distraction. There is a very, very great deal about our lives and about the future, which we can't see, don't know, can't predict. And when people really start to absorb that, and of course, in many ways, the pandemic has been a really crash course in understanding uncertainty. When we really absorb that, many are left feeling completely helpless and passive. If I can't see what the future is going to be, how can I plan my contribution to it? What can I do if planning doesn't work? What do I do? Well, you go back to thinking about Rebecca Hosking and you think, what did she do? She did experiments. And the way that I think about this now increasingly is I think about it as a Venn diagram, which is I see things that upset me and appall me about the present and about the future. And I want to do something, but where, I think, do I intervene? There are, in a way, too many choices or no choices. There are kind of too many options, or I just feel helpless. What do I do? And often this is the point at which people kind of give up because they're overwhelmed by uncertainty. But I think there's an easier way to think about it. So Margaret's Venn diagram. What are the things you're most passionate about? That's the first circle in the Venn diagram. What are the things that upset you the most or that you care about most? And yes, I know there are an awful lot of very upsetting things in the world right now that we all care about, but all of them are not going to be equal in our minds. So what are the ones you care about the most? Then think about, where is there the greatest need? There are lots of things that upset me, but maybe the immediate need is not as urgent. These are all value judgments, of course. But where is there real need in front of me, where I can kind of reach out and touch it? And then what are the resources I have? And the resources may be all kinds of things. They may simply be the people you know. They may be the institutions that you're affiliated with. They may be information that you have. They may be all kinds of tools and assets, but they're things that are useful tools that can make things happen. Where these three circles intersect, passion, need, and resources, is really where you start. You need the passion because change on any level is going to take time, and you need the passion to keep you going, to give you the stamina you're going to need. You want need because you want something which you think is practically addressable. And you need resources because you need stuff to make things happen. Now, a really very simple example. I remember after the Brexit vote being so appalled and heartbroken, really, by the divide it revealed in the country. And I thought, I don't want to just sit there and watch it. And I'm not comfortable with the idea that it's somebody else's problem to solve it. I think it's my problem to solve it where I can. And I recognize that where I live are a lot of kids whose parents have never been to university, and they approach this kind of horrible mountain of applying to university full of fear and trepidation. They're confused. Their parents don't understand it. And there's this terrible tendency to encourage the kids to aim low so that they're sure to get in to somewhere. And I thought, this is unfair. This is sort of setting them up for lower achievement with lower expectations. And so I simply made myself available, saying, look, I do understand how this system works. And if I can help, let me know. I'm very happy to talk to parents, talk to kids, whatever. I'm not a qualified university admissions provider. I just have a sense, and I'm in your village and I know you. And if I can help, let me help. And one example, one tremendously good student, her mother very keen for her to apply to shall we just say, a lesser university. And I said, well, this other university, I know it is much harder to get into. I also know it's your first choice. Let me reach out and find some people there that you can talk to. And what I found were all kinds of outreach people who didn't know who to outreach to. When I said, would you come and talk to this young woman? They were dying to. Went and had a met with her, had a cup of tea with her, talked her through her application process. And, we were all standing by on the day of her A-level results, I think much more anxious, than her teachers. And, she got in completely on her own steam with fantastic grades. And she's still doing extremely well. But she's doing extremely well in a university whose degree is going to get her serious attention in a way that her safer choice would not. Now, this isn't world-changing, but it is for her. And it was something I could do that at least broke this sort of standoff between the privileged and the confused. So I'm not saying, I'm some sort of hero for doing this. I think this should actually be how we live. But I think that thinking about it when we're overwhelmed by the problems that the world faces, thinking about it in terms of what am I passionate about? I'm really passionate about education as a form of social mobility. Where is there need? I can see in my village that there is this problem where people need some advice and some friendly faces, non-institutional faces to talk to. And where are there resources? I know how to talk to people in universities and get their attention. So just a simple experiment of my own. There are lots of other kinds of experiments, and people get really uncomfortable because experiments suggest you don't know the outcome. But that's the whole point. You don't know the outcome. You give it your best shot, exactly as Rebecca Hosking did. And whatever happens, you will learn something more about the system in which you operate and then recalibrate. A couple of other, very quick examples. One of the huge problems facing us regarding climate change is dairy farming. Dairy farming is responsible for a significant part of our carbon emissions. You have companies whose whole businesses are based on dairy, companies like Danone and Stonyfield Yogurt. If they can't come up with a way of producing milk that doesn't destroy the environment, the companies are in an existential crisis and the farmers are in an existential crisis. Way up in the north of Maine is a very small organization called Wolf's Neck Center for Agricultural Research, who have brought together this extraordinary network of agricultural experts, environmental experts, the US Department of Agriculture, a whole handful of universities, and Stonyfield Yogurt to pioneer forms of dairy farming that are not only carbon neutral, but might be a way of replenishing soil. This is a monster project to run, and it's being run by Wolf's Neck, the smallest member of the organization, because there's a recognition that they can have huge impact by keeping the project going, keeping communication flowing, and bringing these very, very different kinds of expertise to the table and collaborating at a high level. Wolf's Neck on its own could do nothing. But equally, without a backbone for this collaboration, you would just have a mess. It's an experiment. It's a very edgy experiment. But if they're able to do this and they share all of the findings that they produce, we may have a very significant breakthrough. They don't know. They can't know. There is no other way to know except to do it. Another example, a nightmare that is American healthcare. Hospital being set up in Austin, amazingly enough, taxpayers voted an extra tax to pay for it, pioneering a new form of interpersonal medicine that shows that when you eliminate power and hierarchy from the relationship between doctors and patients, you can have much better outcomes at a much lower cost. The whole thing is about providing healthcare to the uninsured in Austin, Texas, economically the most segregated town in America. It's a wild, vast experiment. But if it isn't done, how on earth is the nightmare of American healthcare ever going to be changed? except in a highly incremental way. Last example of a great experiment. When the Irish government set up the Citizens' Assembly to consider changing the amendment in the Irish Constitution considering abortion, almost everybody derided this experiment. Politicians said that it was kicking the can down the road. Others said it was just too risky because it was obviously just going to be a huge bun fight. They had done one Citizens' Assembly before, it's true, but they changed the rules this time. They didn't allow any politicians to take part. They made every single piece of evidence and discussion available online so that in general, the whole country could participate in the debate and in the discussions. And what they discovered at the end of this was not just that, yes, they got a coherent response to the referendum, but what they discovered was that when you have a social problem, you need a social process to address it. And that actually, if you consult enough people and you have transparent enough conversations, then even the people who don't like the conclusion can live with it because they've been able to participate and they feel that they've been heard. This is diametrically the opposite of the process that led to Brexit. So this is a really dynamic experiment in the sense that the Irish government is continuing with citizens' assemblies, changing them, tweaking them all along the way. But there's no way to understand the power of legitimacy behind the abortion decision if you don't dare to run the experiment. We have to come to terms with the fact that whether we're doing small experiments like Modbury or big experiments like a citizens' assembly or a new healthcare system, that we start these things not knowing the outcome. Now, this may not sound really radical, except that we're always having what are, to me, endless conversations about a theory of change. Why are we doing this? Because we want the certainty that if we do something and it subscribes to the theory, we are promised the right outcome. But the truth about complexity is you can't predict outcomes in a complex environment. And theories, while they appear to give a level of certainty, especially to, grant funders and people like that, they're only as good as they are until you discover they don't work. The truth is that change happens on so many levels, in so many ways, often through mistakes, often through taking a few wrong turns, that actually this idea that we can guarantee the outcome of our projects is deeply seductive and misleading. What we need instead is the courage to say, I'm making my best guesses. I'm focusing on where there is need and passion and resources, and I'm going to do my best and I'm going to learn from it. And in the light of the learning, I will know what it is I need to do next. Another great form of thinking about the future, of course, is scenario planning. And I don't have time and I don't want to go into all of the details of scenario planning. But I think, again, what's really important about scenario planning is it's based on verifiable data, hard data and soft data. But it's imagining with taking that whole data set for any particular issue, that there isn't a single outcome. There are multiple outcomes. And the job is not to choose one or to think which one is most predictable. Scenario planners never associate probabilities with scenarios. The point is to think through imaginatively with every single one. If this were the future, what would I do? What would I wish I had been doing right now? It's a way of surfacing options, alternatives, and choices. And it requires a high level of imagination and creativity. It's quite interesting. People in very large corporations tell me they have huge difficulty getting their executives to do this because they're so wedded to the idea of planning and certainty. And they often say that actually the best people who do it are young people who play a lot of computer games. Because in a way, a computer game is a scenario planning engine. If I turn right, this happens. If I turn left, that happens. And the experience of playing those, understanding that walking through the choices is part of the fun. It's part of the imaginative experience and reward of the game. And it's that kind of imaginative thinking that we need when we start thinking about what's the future that we want to develop together with pleasure, with joy, in a sense of discovery, rather than trudging through a plan which may or may not work. The last thing I want to talk about is I've spent quite a lot of time last year interviewing many, many people who had survived the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. And I did this because I was thinking a lot about climate change, and I kept thinking the AIDS crisis was the closest thing in my lifetime to an existential crisis that afflicted an entire population of people. And I went and talked to them about not just what it felt like, obviously, to experience such a horrific threat, but how did they think about how to respond to it? And the one thing they did not think about was the master plan, right? Because, they were in a position we now can understand, I hope, a little bit better, which is they didn't understand the disease. They didn't know what the pathogen was. They didn't know if it was possible to develop a vaccine, and they didn't know how to treat it. And in the meantime, they have a community that is completely fractured on multiple issues, together with a healthcare system, in many cases, that just didn't want to know. And yet, they got through. They got through to a point where there is treatment. Now, I recognize all sorts of political and economic issues are still associated with that. But the point is that they got through. What, I asked them, got you through this tragic period? And they had many different answers, of course, but they all convened on two answers. The first was, what did we do? We tried everything. We couldn't do anything else. We had no idea, where we'd make impact. So we just tried everything. We couldn't possibly wait for the perfect plan. We couldn't possibly wait for Big Pharma to get its act together. The government funding that was often promised never even materialized. We had to just try everything. And the second thing they said was actually what kept us going was our friends. Because we did it for them. Because we did it for our friends, for our lovers, together, finding new friendships, finding new lovers, doing it for each other. And it's interesting because that shouldn't be a remarkable finding. Except that when I asked corporate executives who'd gone through their business existential crises, moments when their organizations had nearly collapsed, and I asked them what kept them going, exactly the same answer. One of them quipped rather bitterly, we'd worked together for so long. Of course we wanted to keep things going. It was pretty much the opposite of the gig economy. We had real relationships here. Real relationships are what keep people going through a crisis. We keep going, not for ourselves, but for each other. We keep trying everything because we owe it to each other, and because we know that if we wait for certainty and the master plan, we're wasting time. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Immy, who is collecting all of the questions that have been coming through, and I hope we can start a good conversation.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Margaret. There's so much good stuff there. And we've got some great questions coming through. And it's you really spoke to some things that I've been hearing in the last few weeks, where people have been feeling completely sort of paralyzed as to where to start, what to do, and why, and what's the right moment. And we've had a couple of talks that from different angles have talked about that moment, and how the smallest experiments can be super powerful. Thank you for that. It was lovely. I was mesmerized. I knew you were going to call me back on, and I was kind of like, you can just keep going if you want to. But yeah, let's get into some questions. We've got some great ones from the audience. I'll probably be able to take a couple more before we'll start to run out of time. So send them in now. Don't send them at 10, please. So before we go into the audience questions, I wanted to pick up a couple of things. So I think even as somebody who is involved in work like this, where I get to channel my grief or frustration or anger into like a positive thing and convene and be in community with people that, you know, make me feel like there's a reason to keep going. Even amongst all of that, I feel completely paralyzed by the way that this country has, from a national leadership level, kind of approached COVID-19. And one of the things that I heard you talk about a few weeks ago was how we responded to the pandemic, and how we sort of cut everything back to its bare bones and then expected to be able to survive this. And I don't remember the precise language you used, because this last few months has felt like a complete time warp. But you talked about almost what I felt was like a place, a country, a state, a neighborhood has to be in a state of like abundance in how we fund and invest and design things in order for us to be able to deal with that uncertainty that you talked about. You know, there being problems that are real but specifically ambiguous, right? So, and I just wondered if you could speak about that a little bit more, because I found that really inspiring, and I definitely love to hear about that a little bit more, because I think it plays out at a community level, at a neighborhood level, about how you deal with these massive hits is not by knowing what's coming, but by designing the kind of infrastructure to be able to take, you know, all sorts of different hits. So yeah, could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course, I'd be happy to. So I really learned this by interviewing a very interesting guy named Richard Hatchett, who runs something called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, which was set up about 3 years ago. And interestingly, it was funded by the Wellcome and then the Gates Foundation, pretty much because governments didn't want to know, which is kind of gut-wrenching in itself. But Hatchett, you know, makes a really interesting contrast between what he calls just in time and just in case. And just in time, I think most people are familiar with. This is a way of thinking and planning where you make everything hyper efficient. So you order what you need at the last minute when uncertainty is least. And you have things very, very, very finely tuned. So it's like a magnificent assembly line where every part arrives just at the last moment so that you don't have any kind of, you know, road blockage, as it were. And that's actually how we've run most organizations for a long time. I would argue that since the Industrial Revolution, efficiency has been the overwhelming thing. The problem with it is efficiency only works with things that are predictable. And there's so much in life that isn't predictable. So then you have to start thinking, okay, if you take the predictable stuff out of the equation, you have to start thinking about just in case. So these are events like epidemics, like climate change, like financial crises, like actually even multiple motorway pileups, where they're going to happen, but you don't know when, you don't know where, you can't time it, so you can't plan for it. In those situations, you cannot afford to be efficient because you'll have no margin for error or surprise. Now, after the banking crisis, the government doubled down on efficiency. They called it austerity, right? They ripped out everything that looked like you could live without it. So in some cases, we had hospitals where the intensive care units were run at 100% capacity. Now that looks like a genius piece of efficiency, right? Because there's absolutely no waste. You get your motorway pileup, you just lost, right? You can't actually function. You get a pandemic, you definitely can't function. You cut having more PPE in the cupboards than you need, you can't function. You cut doctors, so you have no spare capacity with doctors. In fact, in the NHS, you have, 40,000 vacancies. But, as long as it keeps running and there's absolutely zero fat in the system, it looks great until something comes along and it just falls over. So I think increasingly when we're talking about organizations that are confronting uncertainty, which, by the way, is just about every organization in the world, you have to recognize that there are a lot of things in the system you can't predict. And they may not even be to do with you, but with your suppliers or your supplier's suppliers. Right? And in that case, you have to have a margin for error and for surprise if you're going to have any kind of resilience in your system. And what really interests me is that a lot of the organizations that I work with now are starting to argue that, all the things we measure in organizations, in terms of return on capital and return on investment and all this sort of thing, is we need to start measuring resilience, because actually that's a better indicator of an organization's relevance and health. Because if it has no resilience, it isn't really relevant to an uncertain world. And my fear going forward about the future is that we are still so addicted to this idea of efficiency, and we are so addicted to the notion that life is predictable, hugely amplified, this fiction, by the tech industry, which seriously is trying to sell us the idea that with enough data we can predict everything. I'm worried that we won't actually come to grips with uncertainty and the need for organizations and people who are truly robust. One way of thinking about this is to think about the world being divided into things that are complicated and those that are complex. So things that are if you think of when we used to fly, right? Things that are complicated include things like going to the airport and checking your bags and food being loaded onto the plane. It's the same every day. It's very controllable. It's very susceptible to efficiency. And most of the time it works pretty well. Once you get up into the air, there are all sorts of things you can't control. You have hugely complex pieces of machinery and engines. You have hugely complex operating systems in the computer systems that operate on planes. And you have weather, geese, all these kinds of things. The first part of suitcases and food, efficiency is really great and very relevant. The second part, complexity and uncertainty, you can't afford to be efficient. So what do airline designers do? They put in more engines than they need. They put in more operating systems than they need, so that if one has a bug, they don't all fail. And so they're building a system which is more expensive and requires more maintenance than is absolutely required, because they understand that up in the air, there are all sorts of things which are inherently unpredictable. So it becomes really crucial in any work that you do to think about how much of this really is predictable, and that can be run for efficiency, and how much actually, even if it's a slightly uncertain, if the impact is great, you need really to design and operate for robustness. You need slack in the system.
Amazing, thank you. I really appreciate it every time I hear that, because I think we know it. Even people working in this space know that intuitively, but needing to be reminded of that and the impact it can have is so important. I'm going to go to some of the audience questions, and then I'm going to finish off with one more question for myself. So Rachel is asking, which traditional organizations are doing this really well collectively, managing uncertainty, breaking away from planning? Who should we be watching and be inspired by?
I think the truth is very few traditional organizations have really got their heads around uncertainty, and they're still addicted to planning, which they regard as primarily a financial exercise rather than an imaginative exercise. if I think of some of the organizations which I think understand it better, one of the companies I've written about a lot is a company named Arup. Arup's a very interesting organization in the sense that, it's a construction, engineering, and infrastructure company. So the engineering is really tight, and they understand robustness profoundly in terms of the ways that they build some of the most amazing buildings in the world. They're the kind of company you go to when architects design something that's never been done before. But they have huge flexibility, for example, in what people work on and how people work. So, for example, I might run a project, and run, let's say, the kind of water systems in a project, because I have real core expertise in that. But I might also have a real desire to start to understand green technologies very well. So I might then go and be a junior contributor to a project that has a heavy emphasis on green technologies. So they have a very fluid use of people who are mostly volunteering for projects, not being assigned, which I think is a much better way to run people, because they're much more committed to the things they volunteer for. And so the kind of the way that work is woven across projects isn't kind of demand driven. It's very much employee driven by who works on what. And what it facilitates is a tremendous cross-pollination of skills, intelligence, and experience, so that it's incredibly easy to get answers to difficult problems in Arrow, because people know who knows what on a very kind of instinctive level, in a way that intranets have never, ever really solved that problem of how do you organize collective intelligence. So I think Arup is very good at that. I think, one of the other organizations I've written about is CERN. So CERN is talk about uncertainty, right? CERN's doing experiments into things that might not exist, where it's not known how you find out whether they exist or not, and wherever a piece of technology that they're building has never been built before. Again, they have these very, very fluid systems of kind of where people work and how they work, and who's in charge of a project depends on which part of the project they're in now. And the fundamental operating system within CERN is everybody has to work with everybody, because nobody has expertise in this, because we've never done it before. Every single thing they're doing has never been done before. So nobody can be expert. Therefore, everybody has to contribute, and only the best idea wins. You see exactly the same thing in the Sanger Center for Genetics in Cambridge, which is really where the Human Genome Project was born, which is that they have a 5-year plan, but it has a lot of slack in it, because year 2, they may discover something that suddenly creates all kinds of other possibilities, and they want to be able to jump on that really, really quickly. 3M, of course, is famous for doing this. So there are organizations out there, but what I would say is that what characterizes them is they understand that they put innovation kind of at the front of the process, not the side of the process. And I think what you see in most traditional organizations is, okay, we're going to do the stuff we always do as the focal point of what we do, and we're going to allow a little innovation over here, which is why it tends to be only incremental. I would say the organizations that understand uncertainty put in innovation at the front of their thinking, because innovation is by its very definition uncertain, because you don't know what it's going to be until it's there.
Great, thank you, Margaret. And we've got lots of questions now, and some of them are a little bit similar. So I hope those of you in the audience are okay with me just picking the ones that are sufficiently different enough, so we can ask Margaret the most amount of things. So I'm going to wrap 2 questions into one. We've got a question from Belinda that talks about how we can encourage and support people to experiment when they are scared of failing, and the system therein punishes failure and rewards certainty. But also sort of linked, not directly linked, but Vicky also asks, what can schools do to support children to build that resilience and learn to navigate uncertainty? So I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah. So I think there are two pieces to this. I think in terms of institutions, I think it's true that generally institutions flinch when you use the word experiment. They like pilot because pilot's much more constrained. But experiments are the real thing because they are acknowledging uncertainty and exploring it, and they're open-ended. But it's interesting. I interviewed a very interesting guy who was chief data officer at the Bank of England, who was confronted by a problem which was going to be more and more and more work, more data, more analytics, no more resources, kind of classic story. And he was thinking, well, what do I do? And the classic thing would have been, well, you take your senior leadership team off to a swanky hotel for a weekend and you kind of would do a little reorg and tighten all the budgets and cross your fingers and hope it works, when in your heart you would know it probably won't. And instead, he did an experiment, which is he said to the whole department, this is where we are. I want any and every idea you've got for how we can make our organization more productive. I don't think it's just working harder. That's not sustainable or feasible. And he got this fantastic array of suggestions. One of them was, well, the senior leadership team should be open to everybody so that we know what's going on. Fine, easy to do. Give it a shot. They did that. Lots of people turned up at first, discovered they're rather boring, and it petered out. But, it didn't cost anything. Second experiment was the annual appraisal process is really horrible. It's not credible. Nobody believes in it, and everybody hates doing it. Can we redesign it? They redesigned it. It became much more engaging, much more credible. People really felt they were thought about, that they had a role in their own professional development. Very, very energizing. Fantastic. A bunch of more junior engineers came forward with a proposal for how they started to tag the data, a different way of tagging data. They tried that on a subset of data. They got a 10x improvement in productivity. And what's so interesting is Oliver Burrows, who ran this whole project, and the experiments kept coming in, said, I think, two things that were really important. The first was there was nothing within the institution of the bank that encouraged him to do this. But there was also nothing that said that he couldn't do it. And he realized that mostly the constraint was in him, the assumption that it couldn't be done. And it was his willingness to kind of test the boundaries, which revealed to him that they weren't nearly as tight as he imagined them to be. And I see this in bureaucracies all the time. People say, I can't do that. Why not? Well, I've never seen anybody else do it. So, have you tried? Is there any particular rule that says on no account must you do this? So a lot of the constraint is in our heads. The other thing he said, which I think is profound, is he said, typically people think of strategy as being a kind of senior activity. But he said, I discovered that all these fantastic strategic ideas at every level of the organization. And I realized that my sense of kind of capacity was kind of tangled up with the hierarchy. But actually, it's in the nature of good ideas that they can and will come from everywhere. And this is very much the thinking at the heart of something that's really developed from Germany, which is this notion of open strategy, which is exactly to this point, good ideas come from everywhere. And part of the job of leadership or management or whatever you want to call it is to create the conditions in which those will bubble up quickly and easily, and not to make everybody feel that they're trapped on their square of the chessboard. As far as education is concerned, I mean, I could go on about this forever. I think we do pretty much all the wrong things. We bring kids up to think, for every question, there's one answer. If you get that answer, then you're clever. So you're going to go far. And if you don't get that exact answer the right way, well, then you're, kind of not very good. The truth is, of course, to most questions, there's always more than one answer, and there are always different ways to get to it. That's mostly not what we teach or we reward. There are schools I've talked to that run failure weeks. where you do well by kind of aiming at something kind of ridiculously ambitious, and you don't get there, but you learn a lot along the way. I think that's really smart. I think the way we all learn to be resilient in the face of failure, sad to say it, is by experiencing it, by trying stuff that doesn't work. I've written lots of proposals for books that nobody ever wanted to commission. I learned a lot along the way, not just about the publishing process, but in terms of all the research I did, and actually nothing's ever really been wasted. I also think, and this is harder, I think, but I think the way we all get really good at change is by doing it. I don't think you can do change in theory. When I look at the people I've had the pleasure of working with who are really great at change, phenomenally adaptable, when I get to know them, they've had lots of change throughout their lives, mostly against their will and sometimes by choice. But actually, it's the people who've walked the straight and narrow path, who've never put a foot wrong. These are the people who struggle in uncertainty, because once the path is gone, they don't know where to go. And it's funny because, my book is called Uncharted. I originally wanted to call it The Path is Made by Walking. And my publishers thought that was all way too poetic because it's taken from a Spanish poem. But it's true, right? Which is, when you think about the future, there is no path. It isn't there. It hasn't been written. It hasn't been designed. It's up to us. And the way we make the path is by walking, by taking one step and then the next step. And then from that step, we can see a little bit more of what's around us, and we might slightly change course. But searching for the path is a fruitless exercise. The future hasn't happened yet. So there isn't a smooth, easy road to get there. We have to just start where we are and keep moving.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm very sorry to some of the questions that I haven't got to, but I hope that this has been a really sort of fruitful conversation, and there's lots of bits of questions that have been answered through the things that Margaret has talked about. And Margaret, I wanted to finish on, this. If there's ever been a time where things feel more viscerally uncertain and different in my life, this pandemic has certainly been the highlight of that. Yesterday morning, we had two wonderful women who were streaming in from New Zealand, who worked in Auckland, and they were talking about the work that they do, and at a neighbourhood, local state level, and a national state level. And when I asked them, they talked about the fact that they were in maintenance and recovery already post-COVID, and all the questions, and just hearing them even say, oh yeah, we're in the sort of maintenance stage and recovery stage, was quite profound. We carried on. When I mentioned how they were feeling about the way the country had dealt with the crisis, they were honest about some of the challenges, but they both were overwhelmingly grateful and full of gratitude for how their country had dealt with it, and for their Prime Minister. And just them saying that, I realised how unusual it is to feel proud of the leadership and feel like you're in something that we're all working together. And they mentioned a few times how they'd felt like the country had worked together, and they're not under any sort of needing to say that because they were on a talk. So I just wanted to sort of ask you to wrap up with, what is that's an example of leadership in a number of uncertain times, right? Jacinda Ardern has experienced multiple crises in her short term already, but that's language about a country that I've not really heard very much in the West. And so I just wondered if you could wrap up by speaking to that. What's happening there? What do you think that we should be looking to, and sort of just finishes off with what we need to focus on and hold on to as we go into these next steps that are uncharted post COVID-19?
I guess I would say, first of all, it seems to me pretty obvious that our national leadership hasn't the faintest idea. And it isn't just that they make mistakes, because everybody makes mistakes in these circumstances, but they give no evidence of having any experience of actually how to get anything done. And that's absolutely disillusioning and disheartening. And clearly there's a whole segment of the population that is putting its mind to how do we change that. But in the interim, I think there are two things to think about. One is to go back to, Margaret's favorite Venn diagram and just think about, well, never mind that. What can I do now? In my organization, in my neighborhood, on my street, in my family, wherever I act, what can I do that moves the world in a different direction? Because undoubtedly what's going to get us in a different direction isn't going to be one person or one institution or one process. It is, like the AIDS crisis, it's going to be everything, and it's going to need everything. So I think we can't buy into a sort of centralized theory of change because it's too slow and it won't work. I think everybody has a role to play here. I think in terms of individual leadership, I think it means that the people who are going to have real power and influence are people who have a great talent to convene, which I think in many ways, Immy, is what you have done here today with your colleagues, which is to convene people and listen to them, really listen, a really good cross-section, diverse bunch of people who have completely different life stories, backgrounds, expertise, experiences. And from that, start to get a much more rounded, complex notion of where are we and where are the bits of the system where we can make an impact. I don't think that leaders in this context are the people who grab the flag and run to the top of the hill with it. I think there are people who really can bring the right people together for a lot of cross-pollination, for a lot of kind of refinement of ideas and inspiration, and who create the condition in which people go off and execute against those ideas and inspiration. So I think that, I think the model of leadership we're seeing in government is so completely outdated in every respect that it's up to us to start to embody the alternative, which is around helpfulness and listening. And that doesn't mean we don't do anything. It doesn't mean we, listen forever. But we understand that we have to get the right voices in the room. We have to listen very deeply to each other and keep asking one question, which is, what would make this better? Somebody has an idea. What would make it an even better idea? What can I contribute to it? What resources can I contribute to it? What language might I contribute to it? And I think that's how we collectively, in a very unplanned, unstructured way, everybody kind of keeps pushing the stone up the hill.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Margaret. We're very grateful for your time and for your insight.
My pleasure, and good luck with the rest of the day. I think I might try the networking 3-minute chat.
Oh, fab, guys! Get in on that, because you might end up in 3 minutes with Margaret Heffernan, which is pretty exciting. Hey,
It'll be fun.